présenter Stephen. Stephen is an independent political analyst. That is one of the reasons why he is able to do 2 books in 2 years on 2 different subjects. He is independent. He's not in any think tank. He's not dependent on funds that come from some area which is going to control the editorial content. He's also a very sharp analyst of US foreign policy, historically and currently. And if there's one way to find out what's going on in the world and what's going on in different conflicts, it's to study US foreign policy. And I think that he has really shown the way in how to analyze political situations. Alors, la conférence va se dérouler en anglais et je vais le traduire à mesure. Et ensuite, il y aurait un échange, questions, commentaires. Stephen.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming. I see many faces that I know from when we did the Syrian book and other faces that are new. And so thank you. Thanks, Robin, for organizing this event. So this book, Patriots, Traitors and Empires, traces Korea's fight for freedom from 1905. And the first steps are taken by the Japanese to incorporate Korea into its burgeoning empire, to a US military occupation which began in 1945 and to the present day. So the book is a history, and like most historical accounts, it's less about shedding light on the past and more about using the past to shed light on the present. So the book then was written with the intention of providing an historical context within which to situate the current crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And the current crisis on the Korean Peninsula is largely traceable to US foreign policy, and that's where I'll begin. So Korea's geography is vitally important to the United States as a world power. Korea shares borders with China and the United States. Or the United States.
Yes.
That would be good.
I knew I was going to learn, but not that much.
With US, yeah. Shares borders with China and Russia, 2 countries that Washington deems enemies, and they're officially designated as such in the US national security strategy. So why does Washington view China and Russia as enemies? Well, they view Washington views China and Russia as enemies because they, quote, challenge American power, and because they're economic competitors. They deny profit-making opportunities in some areas to US businesses. So a US presence in Korea provides the United States with a virtual stationary aircraft carrier on the borders of its 2 most formidable competitors. So as territory then, Korea has immense geopolitical significance to the great power preoccupations of the United States. So from the very first days of the Second World War, more specifically the war in the Pacific Theater, the United States planned to establish for itself a leadership role on the Korean Peninsula, seeing the war as an opportunity to expand US power into East Asia. So ambitions for the United States in the region grew all the stronger when it became clear to US planners that post-war power vacuums in East Asia were likely to be filled by communists and by national liberation movements inspired by communism. Since these movements would hardly tolerate the succession of one empire, so the Japanese, by another, the American, they'd have to be contained and eventually rolled back. That is, if American ambitions of an expanded power in East Asia were to be realized. And so the Korean Peninsula was seen as having an important role to play in the US project of empire building. Now, particularly problematic for Washington was the reality that Koreans en masse, both the North and the South, were inspired by communism and by the Soviet Union, which had enormous prestige at the end of the Second World War, particularly among people who had suffered at the hands of the Axis powers, and particularly among people such as Koreans, who had been colonized. Now, according to US politicians who visited Korea after the war, and also in the judgment of US historians today, if Korea had been left alone to develop as it chose, if the United States had not intervened, Korea would have become communist from south to north, as China was about to become, and as US planners feared Japan would become. Now, Korea would become communist not because communism was imposed upon it, but because the Korean people would freely choose it, seeing it as a solution to the political and economic problems that had bedeviled them for decades. To understand the history of Korea, you have to understand the attraction to Koreans of communism. So Koreans saw that the Bolshevik Revolution as themselves could overcome their oppression through their own efforts. The Bolsheviks offered the Koreans moral support and material assistance. I mean, they called for the colonial peoples of the world, including Koreans, to rise up against their colonial masters and to throw off the chains of tyranny, and they provided what assistance they could. By contrast, let's contrast that with the United States. The United States had declared it was a good thing that Japan had absorbed Korea into its empire. Moreover, the United States itself was a colonial power, like Japan. It had laid claim to the Philippines, to Puerto Rico, to Hawaii, to Guam, and it exercised an informal colonial tyranny over Latin America through the Monroe Doctrine. Additionally, Washington had worked out an arrangement with Tokyo which infuriated Koreans. So in return for Japan recognizing Washington's colonial claim to the Philippines, Washington would recognize and sanctify Tokyo's colonial claim to Korea. So in other words, Washington's hands were as stained by the crime of colonialism as Japan's were. So, at the end of the war, the Japanese surrender bringing the war to an end. And Koreans, for the first time in 4 decades, feel the exhilaration of freedom. And having felt that exhilaration, they had no intention of surrendering their newfound sovereignty to another country, not least the United States. All the same, Washington has plans for Korea, and the plans are that Korea is to be brought under the control of the United States, or at least as much of Korea as possible would be. So US forces arrived on the peninsula about a month after the Japanese surrender. So what was happening in the month before the arrival of US forces? Well, the surrender of the Japanese created a power vacuum. Someone had to fill it. I mean, someone had to make the day-to-day decisions of governing the country. So Koreans of both the North and the South got together to organize governing committees to look after their local affairs. The Soviets were already in the North, and they allowed the committees to govern within the Soviet occupation zone. In the South, the committees took on the task of organizing local civil affairs in what was to become the US occupation zone, but in which the United States was not yet present. So Koreans then organized these local governing committees into a countrywide network and into a new national government whose mandate would be to govern all of Korea. So a republic for, of, and by Koreans. On September 6, 1945, 2 days before the Americans arrived on the Korean Peninsula, Koreans proclaimed their new republic. They called it the Korean People's Republic, the first independent Japanese government in 40 years. 2 days later, US forces come ashore, and the new republic sends a delegation to greet them. The US refuses to recognize the delegation and refuses to recognize the new republic, and refuses for the obvious reason that independence for Korea was at odds with US plans for the expansion of US influence in East Asia. The United States, almost immediately after arriving on the peninsula, set about crushing the apparatus of the new republic within its occupation zone. What happens in the north? Well, in the north, the Soviets allowed the new government to operate. In the north, the republic becomes the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, known today as North Korea, essentially the successor to the short-lived Korean People's Republic. Okay? So, by the way, the division of Korea was engineered by the United States, whose representatives, 2 US Army colonels, one of which would later become a Secretary of State, bisected the country at the 38th parallel for the purposes of creating separate US and occupation, or US and Soviet occupation zones for the purpose of accepting the Japanese surrender. The agreement worked out by the Americans and the Soviets was that the occupation and division of the country would last no longer than 5 years, to be followed by elections for a national government. So in 1948, Koreans of both the North and South asked the 2 occupying armies to withdraw their forces from the peninsula, after which Koreans would organize and hold their own elections. The Soviets complied, withdrawing their forces by the end of 1948. The Americans refused, withdrawing combat troops in the summer of 1949, but leaving behind military advisors and a secret protocol that the South Korean police and military would remain under US control. And then they rushed combat troops back to the peninsula 1 year later. The result is that the United States has had an unbroken military presence on the Korean peninsula for the last 73 years, very long, with a fair degree of collaboration. And there are many Korean collaborators. And the United States' goal, after it arrived on the peninsula, was to crush the independent government, because Koreans who aspired for independence didn't want a new empire to succeed the old one. So what the Americans did was they recruited every collaborator with the former Japanese occupation they could find, including Koreans who had served in the officer corps of the Japanese Imperial Army. So these were quislings or hirelings or collaborators or traitors to the cause of Korean sovereignty. And they would be the people who would run the state that the United States would basically set up on the Korean peninsula to project US power. So, namely, the state was the Republic of Korea or South Korea. South Korea would be a puppet state, essentially staffed at the highest levels by hand-picked traitors and anti-communist zealots. So when the Korean War broke out in 1950, most of the top South Korean commanders were veterans of the officer corps of the Japanese Imperial Army. By contrast, North Korea was founded by Korean resistance fighters who had fought the Japanese occupation from 1932 to 1945. So that is patriots who had dedicated their lives and given their blood to the struggle for Korea's freedom. So when the Korean War erupted, the top commanders of the North Korean forces were veterans of the anti-Japanese resistance. Not quislings and not hirelings and not, collaborators, but patriots or heroes who had taken up arms to drive the Japanese off the Korean peninsula. Now, among the most prominent of these patriots was a man named Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-un. Kim was so important as an anti-Japanese resistance figure that the Japanese created a special unit to hunt him down. Who staffed the unit? Koreans, who would later become top commanders in the South Korean military. So the war between the patriots of the North and the traitors of the South begins in 1932 when Kim Il-sung forms a guerrilla band to fight the Japanese occupation and to fight the traitors who would join the Japanese Imperial Army to enforce colonial tyranny over Korea. Now, Bruce Cummings, who is perhaps the foremost US historian of Korea, argues that the Korean War began not in 1950, which is when we usually mark its beginning, but in 1932. and that the war between the Patriots and Traitors has never ended and is now carried on by their descendants. And to illustrate this point, in 2016, the leader of North Korea was Kim Jong-un, the grandson of Kim Il-sung. The president of South Korea was Park Geun-hye, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who had also served as president and as military dictator, and had served in the officer corps of the Japanese Imperial Army, hunting down Kim Il-sung and other anti-Japanese resistance fighters. So Kim and Park, two deadly enemies, were now meeting each other through their descendants. So, bring this to the current day. Today there are between 27,000 and 32,000 US troops in South Korea, depending on who you ask. 32,000 is what Donald Trump says there are. And the United States has formal operational control of the South Korean military and has had formal operational control ever since there was a South Korean military, which means the South Korean military reports to a US general. Historically, the South Korean military has been an extension of the Pentagon. So the South Korean troops in the hundreds of thousands fought under US command in Vietnam to suppress a national liberation movement of the Indo-Chinese, of people who had a shared history of colonial oppression at the hands of the Japanese. More recently, the South Korean military has helped the United States in its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, interestingly, the North Korean military is often described as aggressive, and the South Korean military is almost never described in those terms. Yet the North Korean military has never fought beyond the borders of Korea. The South Korean military has fought, thousands of miles away in Vietnam, far from home in Iraq, and has fought far away in distant Afghanistan against countries that pose not the slightest threat to South Korea. So which of these two Korean militaries is aggressive? They built a massive military base in South Korea, fittingly on the site of a former Japanese military installation, so kind of symbolizing the succession of one empire or one foreign military occupation by another. Its name is Camp Humphreys, which by some accounts is the largest US overseas military base in the world. And the US Army proudly refers to Camp Humphreys as the largest power projection platform in the Pacific. So that's how Washington views South Korea. Not as a country, not as a place in which people live and work and raise families, but as a power projection platform, as an instrument of US power, as a means to an end, sort of a Korean means to a US end, and not an end in itself. Korea ought to be an end in itself. I mean, not a means of empire building for a people in a distant foreign land. Now, the US national security strategy identifies North Korea as a threat because North Korea is opposed to a US military presence, and because North Korea views Korea as an end in itself and not as an instrument of US power. In the North Korean view, which can hardly be contested, Korea cannot be independent until the US military occupation has been brought to an end. So the United States and North Korea have mutually exclusive goals. And it's because North Korea's goals are exclusive of those of the United States that Washington deems North Korea to be an enemy. But we should note that the very existence of US goals for Korea is an affront, an insult. It's a violation of the concepts of geography and democracy. I mean, Americans don't get to decide what happens in Korea. And that's a basic principle of democracy, and it's a basic principle of geography. So let's talk about nuclear weapons. Doesn't North Korea's nuclear weapons program pose a threat to the United States and its allies, including Canada? Isn't Washington justified in its antagonism to a nuclear-armed North Korea? In my view, the answer is no, and I'll explain why. First, the idea that Washington is antagonistic to North Korea because North Korea has nuclear arms completely reverses the causal sequence. U.S. hostility to North Korea isn't caused by North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons. North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons is caused by Washington's hostility. U.S. antagonism to North Korea didn't begin in 2006 when North Korea tested its first atomic bomb. It began in 1948 when North Korea was established. In fact, it began earlier than that. It began in 1945 when the United States set out to crush the Korean People's Republic, the predecessor of North Korea. Many years ago, John Bolton, the current National Security Advisor, at the time U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, was asked by a New York Times reporter what the United States North Korea policy was. He strode over to a bookshelf, took down a volume, and he threw it on the desk, and he said, "That is our policy." The book was titled "The End of North Korea." So how does the United States seek to bring about the end of North Korea? Well, the organizing principle of U.S. North Korea policy is to wreck the North Korean economy. So the United States prohibits the export of goods and services to North Korea. It has done this since 1948. It isolates North Korea from the world's banking system. It excommunicates it from the system of global trade. The blockade against North Korea is now so comprehensive it has become almost total. This is economic warfare. And economic warfare has enormous, though largely invisible, consequences in terms of human suffering, malnutrition, disease, hunger, starvation, and death. The Allied naval blockade of Germany in the First World War is estimated to have led to the deaths of 750,000 German civilians through disease, starvation, and malnutrition. Sanctions on Iraq during the 1990s led to the death due to disease and malnutrition of over 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5, according to the United Nations. When Madeleine Albright, then U.S. ambassador to the UN, was asked about this by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, she didn't deny that the U.S. blockade on Iraq had killed over 500,000 Iraqi preschoolers. Instead, she said, "We think it's worth it." Now, unlike Germany, which did pose a threat to the Allies in the First World War, Iraq posed not the slightest threat to the United States when Bill Clinton made the decision to impose a blockade on the country. Now we can ask, what kind of monster, in the absence of a threat, makes a decision whose outcome is the foreseeable deaths of hundreds of thousands? Or what kind of monster says, "We think it's worth it"? Now, we shudder at the horrors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which together killed 200,000 people, not 500,000 children under the age of 5, but 200,000 men, women, and children, including, by the way, thousands of conscripted Korean laborers. Less is said about the fire bombings of Tokyo and Dresden and Hamburg in the Second World War. And likewise, little is said about the fire bombings of North Korea. Between 1950 and 1953, North Korea was literally, not figuratively, but literally burned to the ground by the United States Air Force, which dropped the notion of napalm on North Korea north of the 38th parallel. Only 2 modern buildings were left standing in Pyongyang after the United States Air Force got through burning the country to the ground. So fire bombings killed vastly more people than were killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but economic warfare has taken an even greater toll in human lives than economic bombs. Indeed, sanctions can be described without hyperbole as economic atom bombs, in the plural. The political scientists John and Carl Mueller wrote an important paper in Foreign Affairs, the unofficial journal of the US State Department, showing that sanctions in the 20th century had caused more deaths than all the weapons of mass destruction used in history, including the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, including all the chemical weapons used during the First World War. They called economic warfare sanctions of mass destruction, more powerful, more devastating, more lethal than all the weapons of mass destruction. I mention this because no country on earth has been sanctioned as heavily and for as long as North Korea has. So another way the United States works to wreck the North Korean economy is by pressuring it militarily through the incessant threat of invasion to force Pyongyang to starve its civilian economy in order to fund its national defense. The Pentagon applies military pressure primarily through war games, which it conducts annually, often involving up to 300,000 soldiers or more, and so-called strategic assets, which are weapon systems capable of delivering nuclear payloads, so B-2 bombers and Trident submarines. The war games to the North Koreans are indistinguishable from the marshalling of troops and warships and warplanes for an invasion. So every time a war game is carried out, North Korea is forced to mobilize its resources at considerable cost to its civilian economy to prepare for the possibility of an invasion. And this happens year after year after year, and often multiple times per year. And while North Korea devotes a large proportion of its GDP to defense, in fact, a crushingly large proportion, its military expenditures are very small, tiny on a world scale, an estimated $3 to $10 billion per annum. Much smaller than South Korea's $40 billion, infinitely smaller than the United States' $700 billion, and smaller than Canada's $20 billion by at least half and probably more, which means that at best, North Korea is about half as dangerous to the United States as Canada is. It's also been pointed out that North Korea's military budget is no larger than the budget of the New York City Police Department. So in 2002, Washington effectively declared war on North Korea, designating it part of an axis of evil. You may remember the axis of evil. Next, it put North Korea on a list of 7 countries deemed possible targets for a nuclear strike. So in other words, this tiny country of 25 million, which at the time possessed not a single nuclear weapon, was threatened with nuclear annihilation. Third, Washington hinted that an attack on North Korea was just around the corner, was imminent. On the day Baghdad fell to the US invasion in 2003, Bolton told the North Koreans to, quote, draw the appropriate lesson. 3 years later, on October 9th, 2006, North Koreans announced to the world the lesson Bolton urged them to draw. They detonated an atomic bomb. By 2017, they had tested 5 more. A basic principle of nuclear non-proliferation is don't issue existential threats to non-nuclear states, because if you do, they might develop nuclear weapons to defend themselves. Time and again, the United States has violated this principle, threatening to turn North Korea into a charcoal briquette, to quote one US Secretary of State, threatening to make it cease to exist, to quote the US General, threatening to bring about its total annihilation, to quote the US Senator, threatening to rain down fire and fury, the likes of which the world has never seen, to quote Donald Trump. So in other words, threatening to exterminate 25 million Koreans who live north of the 38th parallel. North Korea then has nuclear weapons for the same reason the United States says it has nuclear weapons, to defend itself. And no serious observer in Washington doubts this. So freedom appeared to be within the grasp of Koreans in 1945 after a 40-year struggle against Japanese tyranny. Struggle which at one point involved 70,000 Korean guerrillas and took the lives of countless Korean patriots. But the hopes of Korean patriots were dashed by the United States. One empire succeeded another, one military occupation followed another. Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea and a major hero of the anti-Japanese resistance, recognized that Korea's fight for freedom might last centuries. He reminded Koreans that it took the Philippines and Indonesia 300 years to win their independence. India, 200 years. Sri Lanka, 150 years. Algeria, 130 years. Vietnam, almost a century. It may take Koreans many more years to achieve what the United Nations Charter promises all states: equality and independence. But the dreams that Koreans have nurtured, the dreams they've kept alive, the dreams they've cherished of an independent and unified Korea, free from a foreign military occupation, will one day be realized by their own struggle and with the support and solidarity of people who are committed to an international order of equal and sovereign states. That is, committed to freedom, democracy, and equality, not only at home, but between countries.
Merci, merci beaucoup Stéphane. Merci Robert pour la traduction. Alors, on peut... Alors, je vous invite à poser des questions ou émettre des commentaires, tant en français qu'en anglais, et Robin fera la traduction si nécessaire.
I'm going to leap ahead because most people, I think, are going to ask questions about the present. But about 40 years ago, I read a book by I.F. Stone, The Hidden History of Korea, and his explanation of the war was that the Americans withdrew without really fighting to lure the North Koreans to head to go beyond, away from their defenses, and then they landed and with the aim of taking the whole of Korea, and were stopped by the Chinese intervention. I see that you don't accept that idea, or you don't. Maybe you could just comment on that, and I'll come back with more current stuff later.
Okay. I'm curious as to why you think I don't accept that.
I just was reading the paragraph you had here.
Okay. Which part is it that I don't accept?
Well, it's just that you talked about how everyone was fleeing, and the government was fleeing, and the
South Korean.
South Korean
Right.
were all fleeing, and the North Koreans were advancing. So, and I didn't see anywhere, I was reading very quickly, but it doesn't matter. I mean, this is not the key of what you're talking about. It's just I've been waiting many years to ask somebody who knew about this question. You can say, well, anyway.
Yeah. There is a CIA report that was done in about just before the war. And the CIA report warned the United States that if a war broke out, that the South Korean government would collapse because it had no support at all. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Immediately, South Korean forces fled to the south. The North Koreans advanced very rapidly and took, from their perspective, liberated almost the entire peninsula, except for a small part around Busan. And then there was the U.S. intervention, which you speak of. You could call it an intervention. It was just a stronger intervention. U.S. forces were still on the peninsula. As I mentioned, the United States had withdrawn combat troops in the summer of 1949, but they left behind military advisors, and they left behind a secret protocol that gave them control over South Korean forces. So they were still there. they were still fighting as well when they got their UN mandate. The UN mandate, which was obtained after the fact that they're actually fighting there. And then when the US forces landed at Incheon, they essentially cut off the North Korean forces. The North Korean forces were forced to retreat. MacArthur's forces pushed them back toward the Yalu, dividing the line between Korea and China, then bringing the Chinese in, and then essentially the war stalled around the current demilitarized zone.
I understand he wanted to know what you think about Canadian policy with Chrystia Freeland's recent announcement when they had that event in Vancouver, and then the announcement that they're going to provoke, that they're going to make sure that the blockade is effective by sending airplanes and so on. What do you have to say about Canada's policy?
Well, I mean, Canadian policy is simply follows in lockstep with the United States policy. It's whatever the US policy, that's the policy Canada will pursue. I was thinking of something else when you mentioned that. I mean, one of the advantages of living where I do, in Ottawa, is that there are lots of people who work for the federal government. And there are actually some points in this book that were acquired, information that I acquired with people working for the federal government who disclosed it without realizing they were disclosing it to someone who was writing a book about North Korea or Korea. But I mentioned that because actually I was talking to someone who happened to work on the Korean desk at Global Affairs. And she described her job, which is essentially implementing US foreign policy in Canada, because Canada simply apes the US in terms of its foreign policy, especially with regard to countries like North Korea.
Okay. I asked you earlier, I knew nothing of Korea, next to nothing, and I learned a lot in your expose. Thank you very much. It confirmed what I suspected, but did not know. But my question, and I asked you earlier, Vietnam is sort of a similar situation there was at the same time for a long time, a country that was divided by two. And the question I asked you, the Viet nation basically is just the northern part, and the southern part of Vietnam, for what I know, is basically Laotian, Cambodian. It's two different nations, really, I've been told. How come, with the help of China, and because they had no choice, Russia, northern Vietnam was able to unify and conquer all of Vietnam, and North Korea is not able, even though you tell me it is the same cultural nation, how come North Korea could not get the help of China and Russia like Chiang Kai-shek was able to do it, or is it, anyways, northern...
Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh, that is. Yeah, thank you very much. Ho Chi Minh was able to get the help of China and, by the fact, Russia, to take over all of Vietnam. How come Korea cannot do that?
Korea did have, or rather the North Koreans did have the assistance of both the Soviet Union and the Chinese. The Chinese fought beside the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese Volunteer Army, it was called, at different times. Perhaps, I'm only speculating here, but perhaps the United States was more invested in Korea, was more important for it at the time than Vietnam became. And one of the reasons that was is because the United States was very concerned about what was happening in Japan at the end of the war. And what was happening in Japan was that there was a threat to the United States of Japan becoming communist. And if Japan became communist, that would be a great disaster for the United States. It would become a great disaster because Japan was a highly industrialized country. And this would be the first highly industrialized country that became communist. It was an extreme threat. So the United States planners said, what do we need to do? We need to revivify, to stimulate the Japanese economy, because the Japanese economy essentially collapsed after the end of the Second World War, which was only making communism all the more interesting to Japanese. And one of the ways they thought of revivifying the Japanese economy was by restoring Japan's connections to its colonies. So, how could it do that? Because couldn't restore the connection to North Korea because that was now under control of the communists, but they could restore the connection to South Korea. And this is really the reason why Korea became politically divided, was the United States decided, in fact, this order was given, create a state in Korea within our occupation zone and connect it up with the Japanese economy so that we can bring the Japanese economy back to life.
Thank you, that fits. But I have a secondary question to that. I'm not denying that Japan has elections and is basically politically democratic. But my knowledge of Japan is that its economy is basically communist, and that all their countries are government. There's about 4 or 5 companies in Japan which are all government owned, so it's basically a communist economy.
Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the communism that the United States was worried about in Japan was a different kind of communism,
Yeah.
I guess you'd say.
Political communism.
Yeah. It was the kind of communism that was inspiring to many people at the end of the Second World War, because they looked to the Soviet Union, and here is the Soviet Union who had played one of the major roles in defeating the Nazis and the Axis powers.
And if I would add, Shinzo Abe, the actual Prime Minister, Stephen points out, is the grandson of a Japanese war criminal in Korea. In other words, it's the same battle, but it's like generations going on.
I should also point out that Korea had become highly industrialized as a result of the Japanese colonization. North Korea in particular was highly industrialized, and there was a great concern in the United States that if all of Korea became communist, that meant that, I think one of the advisors to Harry Truman said, if communism could get off to a wonderful start in Korea unless we intervene and ensure that it doesn't happen.
But he's trying to figure out why China, which basically supports North Korea, votes against it occasionally when the Western countries make it. And he says, whereas the U.S., when they present something that goes against Israel, it's just no. Why is it that China sometimes votes against North Korea and Russia too, perhaps?
Yeah, China has its own interests. Sometimes its interests align with those of North Korea, sometimes it doesn't. And this is an interesting point that Kim Il-sung made. Kim Il-sung said, and this is part of the North Koreans have this idea of yushe, which is the idea of self-reliance, but it's really based on the idea that no one is going to look after Korea's interests but Koreans. I think he said, you can't rely on other countries because they don't care. They care about their interests, not about Korean interests. So, I mean, sometimes China's interests align with those of North Korea, sometimes they don't.
His question is, is it possible that Koreans' nuclear testing and so on is playing into the U.S. Game so that the U.S. can justify its intervention and it's in other words, like aren't they playing that sort of like into the U.S. game by these tests, by nuclear testing?
Parce que ça permet.
Comment?
Parce qu'il y a la Chine à côté, qui est quand même un adversaire des États-Unis. Donc quand les États-Unis s'installent dans la région, c'est pas seulement pour la Corée du Nord.
Ouais.
Sur le long terme, on sait que la Chine aussi est guettée. Donc, ce que fait la Corée du Nord, quelque part, arrange les États-Unis qui se dit, bah, ça les arrange.
They're happy, the Americans are happy with it because it allows them to keep their action up because they're aiming basically at China.
They are, and that's the reason for their presence in Korea. It's because, as I said, it provides this virtual aircraft carrier, power projection platform to contend with Russia and China. So you're asking, does the fact that North Korea developed nuclear arms provide the United States with another pretext in which to maintain its presence in the peninsula? Maybe, but it has no difficulty creating pretexts to establish military presences around the world. It has 50,000 troops in Japan. Why? It has tens of thousands of troops in Germany, in Britain, in Italy. It has troops in all around the world, and it has no problems justifying the presence of those troops. There's talk right now about, well, if the North and the South develop a peace treaty, why would you have U.S. troops on the in the Korean Peninsula? But why do you have troops in Japan? I mean, interestingly, the United States says that's a non-starter. We can't talk about that.
Two questions. One is the alliance between the sort of the new development between the Northern Korea and North and South. How do you see the future of it? Will it become a nuclear power that is with the Americans, against the Americans? The question of how you see the current situation there. And the second, as an African from Ivory Coast or French-speaking Africa, people are much more concerned about French imperialism. And they will do, in some ways, they'll ally with traitors, divide countries, and do it. And he's wondering whether what the link is with American imperialism. Is the United States just being the France being sort of like the active part, but basically behind the Americans are behind what the French are doing, for instance, in Ivory Coast or elsewhere. I hope that's, so there's two questions.
So the first concern, the likely direction of Korea, of the two Koreas, and whether they'll unify or establish a peace. It's really difficult to anticipate or to predict. I believe that there is a desire on the part of both Koreas to unify, to come together, to live peacefully. Certainly the South Koreans don't want to become embroiled in a war that the United States precipitates. And, you know, the source of the conflict is really between North Korea and the United States, not between North Korea and South Korea. And one of the reasons that is because North Korea at one point had an agenda, and the agenda was to recover its country and to drive the American forces out. They recognize they can't do that. They don't have the military means to drive the Americans off the peninsula or to defeat the South Koreans. The South Koreans are vastly stronger than the North Koreans. Their military budget has exceeded North Korea's for decades. Their GDP is much larger. Their population is much larger. So the only way that the North Koreans can achieve their goals of independence is to have Koreans in the South achieve them, or to come together. And Koreans in the South also, I think, one of the strategic errors the United States made was frightening people in South Korea, frightening the South Korean government, enkindling these worries that Donald Trump was going to embroil them in a war. They don't want to become involved in a war. So I think that there's certainly an intention on the part of both sides to come together, to unify. Whether they'll be successful, I don't know. Because unfortunately, the United States plays a role, and the United States exercises still considerable influence over the South Korean government.
And then the second question was?
About French imperialism and its relationship to the United States?
In Africa in particular.
I mean, the United States, it's difficult to say that the United States is not an empire. The United States doesn't call itself an empire, and it's not a declared empire. It's not a formal empire, but it's an undeclared empire. And that's pretty obvious when you look at the US military footprint around the world. The United States has troops everywhere. And if you look at Europe, for example, a US general controls the combined forces or NATO forces in Europe. It's not well known that a US general in times of war can also exercise a dictatorship or cancel civilian laws in Europe, in the European countries that are part of NATO. So these are all, indications of an empire. It's a huge empire, and it has its component parts. And some of those parts have more latitude and leeway than others. France has some latitude and can pursue its own interests, but within a certain circumscribed range, as long as it's not encroaching upon or directly encroaching upon US interests. But certainly they do cooperate, and their actions are intermeshed and consistent.
Is it possible that what's happening now is a lot of people are playing for time, that China is militarizing and it's developing its weaponry so that it's also expanding economically and becoming and more tied with others, but it doesn't want to confront the United States right now, that North Korea is in a similar situation, that it's developed nuclear weapons, but it's tested them, but it probably hasn't built very many, or so that it's in a momentary situation where it couldn't confront at the moment, and therefore it's talking about giving it the potential for denuclearization, but nevertheless, it's seen elsewhere what happens if you have no defenses, and so it may also be playing for time, and the Soviet Union, Russia is as well, in terms of, and that would explain a little bit as to why you have a vacillating position with China and Russia, because it's more in their interest to support North Korea and maintain a buffer zone than it is to let it go under, and the threat, of course, is it going under. So are we seeing a attempt, are we going to be facing, because once they start negotiating, it's unlikely that the Americans will be able to come to an agreement with North Korea in a way that North Korea can survive in the long run, because if it gives up its weapons, maybe not Trump, but somebody else further down the line or something. So I'm just wondering if part of what explains what's going on now is that there's an attempt to delay whatever crisis is going to come.
An attempt on whose part?
Well, China, Russia, the North Korea.
Yeah, well, I mean, many argue that this is a moment in which the United States recognizes that Russia and China are growing stronger, and that China and Russia challenged the United States, which is why if you read the U.S. national security strategy or the U.S. defense strategy, they're quite open about talking about these two countries are enemies because they challenge our power, and they talk about a return to great power competition. China and Russia are getting stronger. That means that we're not going to be the top dog anymore, or perhaps they're challenging us for that position. And there's always a danger when that happens that the top country decides that it's going to stop or prevent or launch a preventive war to stop these potential challengers from toppling, the top dog from its perch. You make very good points, and one thing that's often lost sight of is that there's nothing in this for the United States. It has no incentive to negotiate. Why would it? It's not threatened by North Korea, not threatened in the least. So why should it arrive at a peace with North Korea? Its policy has been, since 1948, the end of North Korea. So why would you make a peace deal with North Korea? I mean, the only way you arrive at a peace is if the North Koreans capitulated, and I think that's their approach to these negotiations. Okay, we show up. In fact, John Bolton has said that. John Bolton has said the only reason we're going there is so that they can simply back the truck up to the, and dump all their nuclear weapons over here and surrender. So there'll be no negotiations. It's either you capitulate or this continues. I don't think the United States will attack North Korea because the very fact that they have nuclear weapons, and no one really knows, can they actually deliver them by an ICBM? Maybe not, but maybe they can. And that prevents the United States from attacking them. But the United States hasn't attacked them when they didn't have nuclear weapons either, because their approach is essentially to starve them into submission. That's been their approach since 1953. Hasn't worked very well, but they managed to starve them. And despite that, though, the North Koreans seem to have developed, at least in Pyongyang, a pretty impressive modern city, and maybe an impressive economy considering the extent of economic warfare that's been waged against it. But your point, though, I mean, that the United States really has no incentive here to negotiate is, I mean, perhaps would lead one to a pessimistic conclusion. And the pessimistic conclusion, I think, is probably warranted. The South certainly wants to arrive at some kind of agreement with the North. The United States has no interest. In fact, there was a man who was served on it was in the U.S. State Department Korea desk for 3 years, who said, North Korea has nothing to offer the United States, so we're not interested in any kind of peace agreement. It should also be pointed out that the North Koreans have beseeched the Americans over and over and over again for a peace agreement. And every time they ask for it, the United States simply dismisses them. Colin Powell once said famously, "We don't do peace agreements."
Bon, il est 9 heures.